Wow, good morning. Good morning. It's actually good afternoon in the UK, but good morning if you're in the US. Welcome to YouTube. Welcome to Newsroom. Welcome to episode 1 of 11FS Newsroom, no less. I'm Simon Taylor, and in this weekly show, we deep dive into the biggest news story of the week just gone, and we want to figure out which story means for the industry. Who's going to be impacted? Who's going to benefit? How's it going to change the industry going forward? And my goodness, do we have a story for you this week? Today, of course, we're focusing on that FinCEN file leak that happened. As this story has been a major focus for the media, we wanted to uncover the rumors, the misunderstandings, and what the real story is. So joining me today is Shane Riedel, who's founder and CEO of Lucidday, former head of financial crime and compliance for financial institutions at Chartered, former deputy MLRO at Goldman Sachs. Shane, how are you doing, sir?
Very good. Thanks for having me, Simon.
Thank you so much for being with us. My goodness, there's so much to unpack this week. I'm excited to have you with us. I'm really excited to be doing this new show with you. Thank you for doing show number 1.
My pleasure.
Alrighty, and thank you, audience, as well for joining us. If you have any questions, do leave them in the sidebar. We'll get them to Shane. What didn't make sense about this story? What doesn't add up? What do you want to know? What do you want to learn about all things AML and the FinCEN story? We have Shane with us, who is a phenomenal expert in this stuff. So I'm excited to get through it. But before we get into that, I'm just going to recap the FinCEN story itself, because if you haven't heard yet by now, last week, more than 2,500 documents were leaked from FinCEN, the US-based financial crime enforcement network. Most of the documents were files that banks sent to the US authorities between 2000 and 2017. These files are used to raise concerns about what a bank's clients might be doing, and these files are, of course, called SARs. No, not that SARS, suspicious activity reports. Banks send these files to authorities when they suspect that customers might be up to no good, but these files are not in themselves evidence of wrongdoing, and that's quite important. But the files themselves are important because they're not just documents from 1 or 2 companies, they were from a number of big banks over 17 years. Since the leak, a lot of headlines in the media have been focused on large banks allowing criminals to conduct money laundering. So we wanted to lift the lid on this and try and figure out what's behind this file leak, and who better to do so than Shane, who you just met. So Shane, just remind everybody who you are and what does Lucidday do?
Sure. Simon, we're a RegTech based in Berlin. So I think our operating hypothesis is that financial crime is a multi-metric phenomenon and requires comprehensive data analysis to quantify it and to mature, sort of evolve onto a more mature risk management practice. And so we're the only regulated benchmark in the space, and we're regulated by the ESMA to provide an authorized benchmark in financial crime risk management. So think of it as a bit like sort of what John Moody's did to credit 100 years ago. We're aiming to do to financial crime.
Benchmark indeed. We've got to know how good people are so that we can figure out how they get better. And I think having that some sort of industry standards there can make some sense. How does somebody find their way into dealing with financial crime as a career path?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, my background, I was a UN diplomat before I went into finance. So I think folks come from a lot of different perspectives. I kind of cut my teeth dealing with corrupt politicians and narcotics trafficking, people trafficking in Central Asia. But you've got lots of lawyers who come into the space as well, of course, and sort of bankers who evolve into that space. But for me, it was always positioned fundamentally as a social issue. How do we achieve? How do we push back against criminals misusing the financial sector? Doing so first on the public sector side, and then moving into the private sector.
Indeed, I think people are drawn to it for all kinds of reasons, but I think the human interest side of that gets quite lost. So I guess with that perspective, when the FinCEN story broke, what was your reaction? What did you think of the headlines? What was happening in your world when that happened?
Yeah, so I mean, BuzzFeed news isn't trade press or something. So there was an element of sensationalistic journalism there that I don't necessarily fault them for. I think they wanted to tell it. They wanted to create a narrative that was generally appealing, and in some instances it hasn't necessarily benefited from all available information, right? As you said before, right, the SAR isn't a substantiation of financial crime; it's a suspicion of it, and sometimes I think the line there was a little bit blurry. But what was really interesting, I think, about the FinCEN Files reporting generally was that it sort of took what is a kind of obscure technical issue, I would say not necessarily first on the list of dinner party subjects to discuss, and it brought it squarely within the mainstream and started getting people talking about it, in a space where kind of banks are very, products are very commoditized, banks are very comparable to your kind of average consumer. Building financial crime in as a metric that they're actually using to assess which bank they want to do business with, I think that's a very interesting development.
Yeah, sort of the understanding of the issue coming together with the role banks play was probably not there in the wider society. As I think I said on our podcast last week, those things you mentioned, like preventing narcotics trafficking, preventing especially human trafficking, there's probably an issue that you care about deep down, and which AML touches in some way, shape, or form that people just didn't realize was happening in the background, or that banks have got this sort of crucial role that almost no other sector has in terms of responsibility from a law enforcement standpoint. Well, they don't enforce the law, but from detecting, preventing, and reporting, there's a whole process that sits around that, and there's a lot of acronyms and terms. So let's unpack some of those, because we throw around AML and KYC, and can we just unpack those and why they're important?
Yeah, sure. So AML is a pretty expansive term that's used to describe a lot of stuff, right? So anti-money laundering in the broadest conceivable sense is generally refers to all of the controls that banks have in place to prevent themselves from being used for any kind of financial crime. When we talk about KYC specifically, that is historically the process that banks have used to understand who they're dealing with as a counterparty, whether it be an individual or a corporate. And so, in the UK, this would be kind of getting a passport copy and a utility bill or something like that.
And once I know my customer, it potentially doesn't stop there. It's passport and utility bill. But what about customer due diligence, ultimate beneficial owner? Where does that come into it? These additional terms.
Sure. I think that just represents kind of evolution beyond some of the really basic levels of knowing who you're dealing with, right? Customer due diligence, to me at least, refers to fully understanding who it is, where their money comes from, who they're acting on behalf of. So in the case of an ultimate beneficial owner, your counterparty or your customer might be a Jersey trust or a Panamanian corporate, but who sits behind that? Whose money are you actually dealing with? For a long time, that wasn't really a focus, right? You only had a sort of a box-ticking approach within institutions, and this was the regulatory requirement, that you would know who it was legally who held an account with you. And obviously that misses a tremendous amount of risk if people can operate anonymously behind those structures.
If any of you watching have seen the Laundromat on Netflix, it sort of goes through in great detail how the extremely wealthy or sometimes criminal elements can create holding companies offshore that own a company onshore that owns a company offshore that really hide who the ultimate beneficial owner is. And this enables them potentially to allow a bank to say they knew their customer, but their customer was a shell company or their customer was a holding company. So it's actually relatively easy to create these companies. And this appears to be, kind of, this is not something that the banks have control over. And indeed, they end up sort of having to do detective work to try and figure out who their customer is in many cases, especially when it's so tax efficient in many cases to have companies in different jurisdictions around the world.
Sure. And in that case, I mean, to that point, I think looking at the role that regulators and public sector plays in this, to ignore that is a real mistake, right? The regimes that have enabled those kinds of constructs to exist are creations of the public sector, generally speaking, not the private sector.
and they're just working with them, which is, I think, really, really fair. And then also, whilst we're being fair to the banks, I think we will come back and challenge that, because I often view this whole subject as a curse on all of your houses, public sector, the banks and the regulators, curse on all of your houses.
No one comes out of it covered in glory, that's for sure.
That's absolutely the case. But let's explain tipping off rules, because we've heard this term sort of thrown around a little bit. What are tipping off rules, and why are they so important?
Yeah. So the idea is that if you have a suspicion that someone is laundering money or involved in some sort of illicit activity, you can't tell them. And that makes perfect sense, right? You want to avoid complicity between banks and criminals, and you want to avoid criminals understanding at what point they've been, reported or what have you. But the bigger question, there is: are banks taking advantage of that tipping off to act? And I think this was sort of the allegation that was written between the lines in the FinCEN Files. Are they using that to avoid transparency and sort of proper engagement with the public?
Yeah, it could be an excuse quite easily. It's like, oh well, we can't tip off. But yeah, it's not a get out of jail free card, ironically. Which, excuse the turn of phrase there, but you know exactly what I mean. So talk to me a little bit then about where we go going forward, because if you found yourself and you were still in the bank, and if you found yourself and you were still in the regulator, what can people start to do here? Because there are some structural issues that we've identified with terms of the SAR is really kind of a process. How effective are the bank's processes? How well understood are they by the regulator? Do you think there's some gaps there we can unpack?
Yeah, certainly in the fallout from FinCEN Files, I think there was a lot of discussion around that. You had a lot of voices coming from the bank saying this is deeply and profoundly unfair. We've acted, totally within the bounds of our legal obligations. It's the public sector's fault. The public sector has been, I would say, a little less verbal on voicing their views, and they're somewhat more limited in doing so. But there are certainly things, at least on the bank side and on the public sector side, that can be done. Right. What I think comes out as a theme in the reporting is that banks have struggled to manage conflict well. And this is always a challenge. And I think the FCA has really been at the forefront of identifying and mitigating this risk. But how do you manage the inherent conflict between the need to generate revenue, to service clients, and to control risk? Mm-hmm. And I know in the podcast last week, you talked about this at certainly at the micro level and also at the macro level, down to Revolut freezing accounts. But this also goes up to, in private banking. I go skiing every year with these guys. I know they're really good ones. So these kinds of conflicts, which are just inherent, it's really difficult for banks to manage those. And in my personal view, the reason for this is because there's just so much subjectivity and managing this risk. If we talk about something like credit or market risk, these are really well-defined risk management practices, and people, quantify those, they understand those, they have fairly objective criteria. Whereas when you talk about financial crime, it's all just a matter of perspective, and perspective creates a lot of opportunity for process failure.
Yeah, so financial crime, of course, is such a broad topic. There are so many types of financial crime, and then the subjectivity comes back into it. So if somebody is on a sanctions list somewhere, they potentially become very hard to deal with for the global banking system. But actually, is that a sort of financial inclusion risk because you happen to be in a country where you have been operating legitimately and the regime has done something negative, but you as a business continue to be a legitimate going concern? Is the bank to de-risk the entire country because it becomes too expensive to work with them? What does that mean for the economy? What about social responsibility in that? It's an argument that can be made for and against just about every type of de-risking and risk management because of that subjectivity, which is, I guess, a way of saying, it's hard, but how hard is it? Sort of there's we've seen a few of these things before as well. It's not the first time we've dealt with these challenges.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it being hard is not really a reason to do it badly.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's, I wouldn't say that banks are poorly capitalized. It's not that they're not giving a lot of money to this.
Mm-hmm.
Banks are spending around 3% of their revenue to manage this risk. So it's a huge line item. They're, generally speaking, not producing optimal results. And I think there are systemic reasons for that. The other side, oh, sorry. So go ahead.
So I just showing you that really caught my ear because they're spending 3% of revenue, which is probably more than they're spending on a lot of internal activities for growth, for R&D. I think famously, Ping An spends 1% of revenue on R&D, and that's considered market leading. So that's a massive investment, and yet the effectiveness of it seems to be woefully inadequate. You've probably seen more recent data than me, but I think the last UN study I saw was something along the lines of an estimate of $2 trillion is laundered globally annually. And of that, we detect about 2%. And of that 2%, we successfully kind of begin law enforcement proceedings against 2% of the 2%. So this is a woefully inadequate system. I think inadequate is ineffective is kind of the watchword here.
Yeah, you're not getting good
so much
return
money
on
is being
investment.
spent on it. So what's going wrong?
Yeah, the fundamentally, I think the idea is again very similar to credit. When credit was managed 100 years ago, it was based on kind of handshakes and personal knowledge, and that worked in that environment. That's the equivalent of what happens today. Sure, we have some technology that's in place, and it's super costly, because it's so ineffective. But I think there are certainly a number of reg techs who have stepped into this space who are helping to evolve the system a little bit beyond where it was. There are also subtechs who are doing the same on the supervisory side to enable both types of institutions to really kind of move beyond the practices which are currently in place. And a lot of the controls that banks use at the moment, for example, are their ineffectiveness ratios are kind of 95%, right? 95% false positive ratios. To not necessarily, to my mind, it's not a great success if you then achieve a 92% false positive ratio.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of the idea that we're going to optimize our way out of this problem.
Yeah,
I think
it's
the
a
approach has to
suggestion
change.
that a 5% effective process, and even then 5%, it's effective at actually catching something that looks bad 5% of the time it's used, but it's not catching 5% of all the activity. It's catching way less than 2% of all the activity.
For sure.
The numbers in this are absolutely staggering when you really drill into it. The scope of this problem, and as you say, there are some reg techs that can really generate sort of performance differentiators there. But there's a good question here that's coming from I think F4P tutorials. So good name. I don't know what you do F4P tutorials, but thank you. Apparently, banks have largely outsourced KYC activity and process to service centers instead of leaving the responsibility with front office and relationship managers who know the clients best. Is that not a risk?
Yeah, of course. I mean, and I think it also doesn't serve clients well. My personal view is that if I'm going in for a loan to a bank, I'm gonna audit my own financials, and I'm going to own a lot more of that process. So to me, creating a shared data set between customers and banks is really the direction this needs to go in, creating a golden source that enables people to derive risk judgments out of the same data set. Makes a lot more sense than identifying the cheapest possible person in the world that you can find to do the job and asking them to do it for you.
Well, so that's interesting. You mentioned 3% of revenues are being spent. Well, no wonder you try and outsource that and manage that cost if it's so expensive.
For sure, makes sense.
But actually, if you've got people that are entrusted with managing market risk and credit risk, but my understanding was most banks had sort of the three levels of support, or three levels defense.
3 lines of defense.
The front line is the first level, the second line is specialist, and then the third level is the real specialist. Is that not the case in most organizations?
No, I think that's absolutely right. The question, I think the question that was raised is, should we not be pushing this into the sort of first line of defense, i.e., the salesperson? And certainly, it's part of the DNA of bankers to manage risk. So that's what they do, and it makes sense to ask them to manage this risk as well. The problem here is that we don't give them data or metrics to do it. So it's not really fair to say, well, the business is responsible, the first line is responsible for the ownership of this risk, and therefore if it goes wrong, they have accountability for that. But we gave them absolutely no insight into the risk nor any data from which to judge the risk.
And I think that's it, isn't it? You're very happy to hand off responsibility, but very happy to give away the knowledge and the special power. And I think this adversarial relationship between the business, this is a thing that only really exists in banks. Yeah. The idea of the business, that somehow over there, you are the business if you work for it. But there is this very adversarial control function versus business thing that's sort of been set up. And in actuality, none of those organizations want to find, but the only win for the control team is, hey, look at all the bad things we prevented. And the only win for the sales guys is, look at all the sales we did. Incentives matter here. Is there something about org design and incentive structure that we should be looking at?
Yeah, for sure. I was chatting with the CDD head or the KYC head at one of the large European banks recently, and this was exactly his goal. Not necessarily a 95% quality of execution or something like this. He wanted to restructure incentives. He wanted to make people think differently. And fundamentally, that's what needs to happen. As long as the incentives remain the same, we're not going to expect a fundamentally different result. And again, just because we make the technology that exists a little bit more efficient, it's not going to produce a different result.
I really liked Ollie Bett's point on the podcast this past week, where he said, as a consumer, sometimes you feel this in terms of a payment didn't go through, but as a corporate, you feel it a lot more because they're making larger transactions and they're dealing with masses of paperwork. But there have been several attempts to build KYC registries from Swift, for instance. And there are some things on the horizon like GPI Swift and the Interbank Information Network from JP Morgan. What are the other things out there that you've seen that offer some element of hope?
Yeah, I mean, here I'm a little biased, right? So, my view is that the approach that the market is taking to ESG, so the quantification of these types of risk, is bound at some point to spread into this space, and it needs to. We need to be able to assess and judge our counterparties on the basis of something objective. This isn't just my opinion. I think when we look at whether it's the Nordic banks or what we've seen with the banks who are named in the FinCEN Files, the dramatic sweeping changes in share price for some of these banks as a result of financial crime scandals shows that the market wants to quantify this risk and structure it in a way that's a bit more clear and objective and comparable. But I mean, there's a load of RegTech solutions, like I mentioned before, that are out there that I think are doing excellent work in kind of optimizing some of these processes and enabling banks to do a lot more with the same resources, or in some cases, less resources.
Yeah, better doesn't have to mean more expensive. And I think that
it for sure can't in this space, right? At one point, HSBC had 9,000 people working for them whose job was in one way, shape, or form to manage financial crime risk. I mean, that's crazy. ABN has 10% of their staff managing financial crime risk today. So it's not sustainable, and the consumer is going to start feeling that if we just continue to grow it that way.
And that's such a key point. If this thing is 95% ineffective of what it does spot, and 2% effective at even detecting anything, like this is so bad that hiring lots of people is not the answer. And in 2012, with post-financial crisis, with the reforms that came in from FATF, maybe the spending lots of money and hiring a lot of people had the share price bump and the market felt better. Post-Panama Papers, post this, that just doesn't feel like an option. It's time to get a little bit more creative. Good question from Carme here, who says, the regulators are the ones who collect all the SARs. What's stopping them from mapping all of that data and spotting more patterns?
Totally right. What the banks are doing, if you think of it in another way, is sort of they're highlighting the dots, and it has to be down to the regulator to connect them. So there was an article in the Swiss press last week that the former head of the FIU, he left, and one of the reasons he left was because there was such a bottleneck. 6,000 of these reports from banks hadn't even been reviewed from the previous year.
Oh
so
goodness.
I mean, that's in addition to, this isn't just a US problem; it's a global problem where we're underutilizing the data set.
Wouldn't it be cool if there was a communication or messaging standard of some sort? Instead of filing a SAR as a paper report, there was an API that they hit with all of that data, and that just dropped into a database. Funnily enough, the crypto industry has come up with something called intervasp.org, which is a messaging service between the virtual asset service providers, where they can communicate amongst each other and allow the regulator in to see that. And weirdly, as worried as regulators were about the crypto space, actually, maybe in that is a nucleus of something that you could start to use, where you say to the banks, instead of having lots and lots of people filing lots of pieces of paper, why don't you just give us the data from the systems? Or why don't you just hit this API endpoint? Yes, you're going to have to develop to it, but instead of hiring people for an ineffective process, actually, maybe we can share some of the cost across the industry as a utility. How do we start to share that? There are so many things we could do here. And I think that's a really positive thing coming out of this conversation.
Sure.
Where would you leave the audience? What are your summing up thoughts here in terms of your takeaway from the whole experience?
Look, I'm equally sort of bullish about the future as what you've just articulated. I think that bringing this into the view of the general public, getting this talked about in normal people's company, not just technical experts, means that there are going to need to be new solutions explored in order to manage this problem. So if this allows either banks to start to change their internal calculus, maybe lower their fear of failure a bit, so they're prepared to take more risk, to try new things, I think that's a very, very positive outcome. And likewise, on the regulatory side, 28% of regulators use any form of technology at all. So 3/4 aren't using technology to understand this risk at the moment. And that clearly needs to change. There are lots of opportunities out there to make it happen.
This would be a great use of a regulator's sandbox as well, to run some sort of challenge and to see how the industry can come together and really proactively solve a non-differentiated problem that is in society's interests, and actually by being proactive in it may even have the side effect of impacting bank share prices. So let's hope. All right, well, that's coming to the end of the half hour we had. I told you that it would fly by, Shane. I'm sure you got days to get to if you're watching in the audience. Thank you for the questions. Where can people find out more on what you do at Lucidday?
Oh, you could look at our website, elucidate.co, or you're welcome to reach out to us anytime.
Thank you so much. All right, that's all on Newsroom for this week. I hope you enjoyed our first ever show. Don't miss our other live show, Spotlight, which goes live on Thursday at 3:30 British Summer Time or 10:30 Eastern Time if you're in the US. On this week's episode, we'll get to know John Ostler, who's the CEO of Finder.com. Alrighty, have a great day, everybody. Have a great week. Bye for now.